By the way, today I'm wearing my hat as a futurist. Many of you are used to me speaking on as a Bible teacher or as a dentist for some of you. Today I'm wearing my hat as a futurist. And this is the book, which is available. It's available. You can get it at my office in Jubilee Dental and also get it at Aristoc. It's available in Aristoc at 90,000. Which is very good value. I've seen books at 19,000 which don't have as much value as my book. I did, that was almost a 3.5 year research condensed in there and over 700 references. So it is a book based, it's more out of an academic paper, but it's a very well researched book. And it will tell you a lot about leadership, about think tanks. In the book, I do a case study of Botswana as an African country that has been able to grow steadily over the last 60 years. Then I showcase the development context of Africa uh, and juxtapose it against what happens in Southeast Asia. So there's a case study, there's a chapter which has a brief case study on leadership and think tanks in Malaysia, one in Singapore, one in South Korea, and then the role leadership and think tanks played. So you'll find that quite an engaging reading. It is not. It is talking about that sphere of things. It's not. So you'll not find Bible verses quoted there, but it does bring across something very, very needed for our time. Right. So this is initially three-part series. I'm thinking we may do some more later because it's an area I think we need to be attuned to. I have a feeling it's going to become very core. You know, in the year 2000, when COVID happened, it took us by surprise. And as a result, people everyone became a doctor. We're looking, we're reading about hubs, about this drug, and people, there was so much research going on around the area because it was an issue of global concern. I have a feeling, I just have a sense that the whole issue of the global economy is going to become a major concern soon. I don't know when. I know in 2008, when we had the global financial crunch, it hit the world. Maybe it did not hit us as directly here in our Africa. It eventually did, but our economies don't run so much on credit. But I remember the crisis many people had where suddenly their credit cards were not working. And in some of those countries, you don't carry money. I was recently in South Africa. I did not use South African money at all. Or I think I had some which I'd kept from a previous visit. Earlier in the year, I spent a number of weeks in Canada. I didn't touch the Canadian dollar. You know, things are working differently. Now, in 2008, when these things happened, there was a very big disruption. And, you find people now begin to understand economics and so on. And I'm not an economist. I mean, I'm speaking from my place as a strategic leader and one who is a futurist and one who has been trained to study things. So I want to make that disclaimer from the beginning. I'm sure the economists on the call, and I would really invite critiques of anything that I say. But I believe there are things we need to understand so that when we're not lost. So the first part was historical. I'll just quickly run through it, and then we shall talk about the last 100 years. And in the next session, we shall look at what may be lying on the horizon. Now, the I think the point I made last time is that we are really so connected to the global economy. Every time you take a cup of coffee, or in Uganda it is local really, but anything that you buy now, you send money through an app or something like that. You're participating in a system that has been thousands of years in the making, and it's important to understand how the system works. We began by looking at, without going too much into the past, we looked at the earliest people, but hunter-gatherers and barter trade. We looked at that and what it looked like. If you were to move back in time and be in Uganda 200 years from now behind, we're talking about 1825, huh? Or even, yeah, 1825. There was some trade going on, but they were probably not using coins. I don't know, coins are not even come. Coins came much later. You would exchange goods, it was barter trade sort of thing. It was an economy of sorts. Then we also looked at it from the biblical lens, giving examples of the earliest societies and specialization. We talked about Jubal, livestock, music, Tubal Cain in Genesis chapter 4, specialization in trade, the Tower of Babel, and the economies that were there in the days of Father Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the livestock alliances. There was an economy of sorts. Even today, in parts of our country, there are places where cows are what? Are wealth. And it's true because the cows are like the bank. If you need something, you sell a cow. So there are those earlier civilized methods of economies that used to work. So we explored the birth of money, and by the year 1000 AD, or before Common Era, that's BC, before Common Era. What was happening at that time? That is covered in the first presentation. Empires like Persia, Rome, China, and so on. And then we also looked at Africa, the Egyptian civilization, and Nubia, Kush, the trans-Saharan trade, coastal and Red Sea trade, which linked Africa to Arabia and India. There was an economy that was taking place and it has evolved. I think one of the challenges of not having a wide perspective is you look at things just now, but things have been evolving and they're not stopping. Even now they're evolving. Even now they're evolving. So it takes a bit of stepping back to see what could be coming. We had a brief look at Israel's covenant economy, um, where God talked about land belonging to him, the Jubilee year, the commandments for just trade. Those things are still applicable today. And we also looked at Israel and Judah transitioning to monarchies and how the economies grew more centralized, taxation, trade. We had a brief snipe at Solomon's reign. So the Bible does talk about economics. And then we talked about the Roman Empire and the New Testament era, what was happening at the time of Christ. Jesus teaches a kingdom centered economy and he warns against greed, he urges generosity. We see the early church involved in voluntary sharing and so on. So really, we're taking a very quick ride coming back to modern times, the Middle Ages, trade connections and trade guilds, the Islamic caliphates in the Middle East. We talked about the Silk Road, the Chinese bringing things from China. So it's called the Silk Road, Indian Ocean trade routes. And then what happened in Europe with the fairs in France, merchants being drawn from across the continent, trading wool, wine, furs, merchant guilds or like chambers of commerce, something like that, cities like Venice and. So we took a very, very quick run through. Um, and then we looked at Africa as well, trade within intra-African trade kingdoms trading with each other. And yeah, and then the age of exploration. The age of exploration, where people began to go by ships, and then a new era emerges of superpowers: Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Britain. The age of exploration, driven by a hunger for wealth and new trade routes, and how nations believed wealth meant hoarding silver and gold, and by exporting more than importing. So we took that journey in the last session. We briefly talked about the transatlantic, the slave trade and how it affected um, the economies and the nations and how it affected Africa. In Africa, if you go back the eras of the slave trade, there are commodities. Today we have commodities. People are going to China, they're probably going to Turkey, or there was a time when Britain was the main source of goods. In those days, human beings were being traded, ivory, and in some places gold, and so on. There have been, and some big kingdoms grew up at that time. And then we talked about colonialism, capitalism and banking, which was in the 18th century when the banks began to take shape. We talked about the industrial age and globalization. in the from 1800 to about 1913, and each stage paved the way. And leading the way to about 1913, this is where we paused, looked at the scramble for Africa and how trade was used as a catalyst, um, and the disruption caused by the slave trade. I'm just giving you the headlights of what we looked at last time, and then lessons that led to the modern era. So just appreciate that we are not talking in a vacuum. There have been thousands of years before us that have led us to where we are now. And we did mention some overarching themes. The fact that God owns everything. That's what overarching themes on from the Bible and the economy. Stewardship. We are called to be stewards, not owners, but stewards. And justice as being very, very key in God's dealings with man. And also to understand that human economies are temporary. So, for those of you who are not there, that is give you a snapshot, and for the rest of you, just a reminder of where we came from. Now, as we begin to look at this particular season or the time we're in, the last 100 years, it's not a very long time. Um, that is a book I would want to recommend if you can lay hold of it. It's a millennial perspective. It covers a very wide span by a man called Angus Madison. It provides a very comprehensive view of it's data driven as well of global economic growth, GDP, population, and productivity, with very clear tables and summaries. So I'll be referring to it quite a bit in this presentation. And this central thesis is that global economic growth has been uneven across time, also uneven across regions. I think doesn't take much to know that, in the way back, it was the East, which was the center, China, India, and then it moved to Europe at some point. Then centered the United States has swung back. Some parts of the world have moved, other parts have not moved. Okay. And it's been driven by technological innovation and institutional changes, and also policies, for shifts in policies. And that has resulted in disparities between nations. We are in a very uneven world, a very, very uneven world. And part of it is because of technology, but a good part of it is because of policy. There are certain things that have been ruled out. We'll look at some of them today that have ensured that certain parts of the world remain in a certain zone. And as people who are interested in both the world and in the kingdom, there are things we need to address. So just a brief overview on what this book brings out. Basically, he argues that the transformation since 1900, which is the period we are looking at, has had those various factors playing, but has resulted in very uneven living standards in different parts of the world. The West led the early part of the growth. In the late 20th century, shifts began, new economies began to emerge and to catch up. Actually, part of the tension in the world now is because countries that were labeled third world are catching up, and they're making certain other countries very unsettled. Excuse me. So he looks at this GDP over centuries, and he shows that sustained growth is a modern phenomenon. It was never there in the past. It is really a more modern phenomenon, from around 1820, after the Industrial Revolution. That's when we begin seeing this growth due to technological advancement. So, and then it talks about regional disparities, as I've mentioned, divergence in performance between the regions, particularly Western Europe and North America, with slower growth, very much slower growth in Asia until more recently, and then Africa and Latin America. And so he calls it the Great Divergence. The Great Divergence. So it widened inequality. The rich became a lot richer. The poor Well, comparatively, if you look at Africa, you would certainly say, you would not say we are worse off than we were 200 years ago. I think there's definitely been an improvement, but the disparity between the rich countries and the poor countries has widened dramatically. And then he also addresses key growth phases, and he mentions before 1820. This was before the full impact of the first industrial revolution. Slow growth, very slow growth at minimum per capita income increases. Per capita just means the benefit per head, capita per head per person in the country population. And then it talks about 1820 to 1950, where there was moderate growth, and it was driven by industrialization in the West. And then 1950 to the year 2000, where there was rapid growth. And this is where Asia began to emerge. So Japan, China, India, they began to narrow the gaps. And then he also addresses the role of institutions and policy. And he says economic growth is tied to institutions, property rights, policies, human capital development, and countries with adaptive institutions thrived, while others lagged behind because of instability. This was really the toll of Africa, or also colonial exploitation, and that's been our case here. Those colonial exploitation, which also was fixed in certain policies. For example, one of the things that happened was that the colonizing powers ensured that their colonies were mainly producing the raw materials. All the value addition happened in their territory. This is something our president has sung and sung until some of us have heard the song. For example, cocoa. The countries that produce cocoa, Ghana, Ivory Coast, produce large amounts of cocoa, but they do not, I know that they've got now a factory, not a single factory making chocolate or any of these things in Africa. The big factories are all in Europe. Same with coffee. The biggest earners from coffee, and David Sapuya is on the call. I'd highly recommend his book, Africa's Industrialization and Prosperity. It brings out these points very, very powerfully. The fact that this disparity has ensured that the countries that were colonizing uh, have maintained their lead, in as far as the economies are concerned. And then they made policies and tariffs. We are hearing a lot about tariffs now. Tariffs are not new. When we want to export anything, they will not accept certain exports from us. It's by law. They will not. Or if they come in, they have charged so highly that it doesn't make sense. So even if in Africa we have the most arable soils in the world, in terms of our soil being able to produce good food. I mean, I eat food. Food grown in Uganda is some of the best food in the world. I can tell you. I've traveled to close to 40 countries around the world. The same thing, but the taste is very different. Our soils are generally still good, but the trade policies make it difficult for us to actually have proper growth in agriculture through agriculture. So basically, he was talking about the role of institutions and policy. And then last, he talks about data-driven approach using very detailed historical GDP and population growth. This man, Madison, provides evidence to track economic performance. So this work is a very foundational resource for understanding global economic history. I know most of us may not be interested in the details, but some of you may, and I recommend the book. Now let's go back. And if we don't finish this one in time, we shall do a part 3 of it. I don't want to overrush it because this is where some of the understanding is really going to kick in. So you may or may not have had. Let me just do a quick census here. How many of you know what the gold standard is? Can I just say by show of hands? Just activate your hand. You hear about the gold standard, the gold standard. What do you know what it is? The gold standard. Okay, I don't see many hands going up. Okay, so we should spend a little few minutes talking about the gold standard because you'll need to understand it. Just to let you know countries all over the world are holding gold now. Russia, China, the United States now. I think Uganda has also joined. They are keeping gold, and that tells you something is happening. Okay, let's try and explain it simply. We'll take our time. If we don't finish today, we shall have a part two. Now, the gold standard was a money system where currencies were directly tied to gold, either through converting, that sorry, currencies could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold, or in some cases, gold coins were used as legal money. Just like you have coins now, I have some coins around me here. They were made in gold. Now, the basic argument is this, that everything that we have has value. My time has value. If I'm doing work as a dentist, it has value. If I'm selling water, water has a certain value. And that value needs to be constant, you know. And so they had to get a rare resource, and gold is a rare resource. You can't just create it anyhow. And so gold was made the standard. So if I was to use any money, like tender, that piece of paper is just saying that this piece of paper is equivalent to this amount of gold, which we already have. That's a very important point to get. So you first get the gold, then you can issue saying that this amount of money is best. This represents the amount of gold. So if I at one time I say I don't want the money, I want the gold, you'll produce the gold. That was a very basic idea. And that idea dominated global finance from the 19th century until the mid 20th century. Okay, that's about 70 years ago, not too long. Okay, it was used significantly in Africa during colonial rule. So it had key features which we'll just go over. So the core principle here is that a country's money or currency was pegged to a fixed quantity of gold, and that ensured stable exchange rates and also limited supply to gold reserves. For example, in the 1900s, the British pound was fixed at about $4.25 per ounce of gold. And the US dollar was fixed at about $20.65 per ounce of gold. So it was a standard, you couldn't fix it. And you couldn't just print money. That's another thing we need to appreciate. Uh, Especially, well, more today countries can print their currency. So what happens with many governments is they just print money. If money is in short supply, you keep printing. Now, if you keep printing money, guess what? There's so much money in circulation. It's called inflation. Hmm? And so when there's money in population, everyone can afford things become prices begin going up because there's a lot of money chasing a few goods. So your prices go up. I hope I'm being basic enough because I know many of us are not very tuned to economics. But I'd like to interest you to at least train yourself, get a basic understanding, get YouTube videos, ask it questions, get AI, ask it basic questions so that you get a basic understanding. Because I think the next season in our world is going to be very key for understanding this issue of finances, especially. So there's a going called standard current circulated as money, like the gold British sovereigns. They also had the bullion standard, the gold bullion standard. Paper money was convertible to gold bullions, amount of bars, gold bars. And they also had a gold exchange, where currencies were pegged to another gold-backed currency. So initially it was the pound in the colonies. The British pound was the king in that early part of the last century. Later on, it became the dollar. Initially, it was also tied. So we will not probably tie to the gold, but we'll say Uganda shilling is worth so many dollars, worth so many pounds. Yeah. So the purpose of this was to stabilize international trade by ensuring that money was predictable. If I did business and if I started building a project over the next 5 years, money will be stable. It will not change. The value will not change so much. And that was really what enabled commerce to take place during the colonial era. So from 1900 to 1914, this was really the peak of the gold standard. Most major currencies, including Britain, France, Germany, the US, they held on to this gold standard. And the primary reserve currency was the pound. In the picture there, you have, of course, at that time, Queen Elizabeth was not the queen, uh, but they had, not that it was King George or something like that, but they had, those were the currencies that were the standard, you know. If you are traveling, like now you are traveling to other part of the world, you want to have dollars because you can exchange them. So the British pound was really the main one. And at 1962, it said they had about 62% of the global reserves, according to IMF historical data anyway. Now, at the start of the 20th century, most major economies operated under the gold standard, as pegged with the dollar. So that is the key thing to note out of this particular headline. And in Africa, uh, colonial powers imposed gold-backed currencies. Okay, so they had, for example, the British West African pound, the French African franc, replacing mediums. That before that time, most African societies worked with cowries, and these things now began to tie the African economy, which was operating in its own way. Cowrie shells were used, barter trade was used, but the introduction of these currencies began to connect the African economies to global trade. But the priority was on colonial interests, and the major interest was colonial interests. So, but they introduced that into the system. It was the colonial powers that introduced it. Now, in the next season, which was 1914 to 1930, there were some disruptions that took place. The first major disruption in this season, it was really one major one, the World War, 1914 to 1918. So that standard, which was there before then, caused a lot of disruption. Something else happened in the United States, which we will handle later. It was the formation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. Very interesting. It happened 1 year before the war started. But they led currencies to suspend gold convertibility because of the war. People began to print money. The big economies that were at war began to print money, and this caused inflation. Britain struggled to restore the pound's value before, and the which was about 4.8, 4 point, the figure I gave earlier, for pounds, and it led to economic stagnation. So the First World War disrupted. At the beginning of that of the 19th century, the British were so um, they really believed they would dominate the world, till eternity. That's why you had those very, very strong imperialistic statements about the sun never setting on the British Empire. They were all over the world. Uh, Now, the US began to emerge as a much stronger. The dollar began to gain prominence because of the chaos in Europe. By 1920, the dollar's reserve share rose as Britain declined. So there was a change happening. Now, those who lived at that time may not have realized it, just like we are living at a time when there are changes happening and we may not realize it. The pound began to lose strength, the dollar began to gain strength. At that same time in Africa, colonial currencies remained. They were tied to the colonial dollars, also tied to the reserves, gold reserves. But there was very little benefit for Africans, there was very little benefit. Exports were the major thing. A lot of gold was leaving from South Africa, cocoa from Ghana, cotton from Uganda, coffee. And these things enriched the colonizers. So 1914 up to about 1930. Now, from 1930 to 1944, there was something else that happened. And that was one of the key things was the Great Depression. You hear about the Great Depression, it's about 10 years, 1929 to 1939. Now, this forced countries like Britain in 1931, and then the US in 1933 to completely get off the gold standard. Remember, we say the gold standard is where you have gold. You would not issue any currency unless you had a reserve in gold. And that meant things would remain stable. The First World War destabilizes everything. Countries begin to print money instead of following that gold standard. And then the Great Depression takes place in 1929. And
Oh,
Britain itself gets off the
well,
gold standard. Please keep your microphones off. And US also throws it off. And so they devalue currencies. And this led to a lot of volatility when it came to exchange rates. Now, in Africa, we did not have autonomy in how we handled our currencies. So we are tied to these shifts. Whatever happened in Europe affected us here. And so the net result in most of Africa was prices fell. Prices fell. And then just talk about, let me see if there's anything else I need to cover here. So basically, just to appreciate the pre-1913 era where there was a gold standard. And then note that in 1913 had the Fed. Well, I think we'll need to talk about that at some other, maybe one of our subsequent meetings to understand how that operates, because it's also important to understand how that works. And then we have the First World War. Our economy, we are now colonies. So whatever happens there affects us. And then the Great Depression, which again did not happen here. It happened out there. But because our economies were tied to the economies out there, we were affected. And the major impact for us was also in the commodity prices, which were also controlled by the colonies anyway. So again, quick swipe across Africa. I think I've covered many of these points here. I've mentioned the fact that before 19, 1940, well, 1900, we used cowrie shells, gold dust. The Santis used gold dust. There were salt bars that were used in some places. In West Africa, they used things called Manila rings. And these were mediums of exchange, often working side by side with barter systems. They were used for trade, even including the transatlantic slave trade. These are some of the things people brought. Europeans often would bring these trinkets they had, mirrors and so on, guns. It was really pretty much exchange. And European accounts often they mislabeled this as barter due to lack of formal denominations. But we had our own system. Okay. Sometimes it was barter. You bring beans, I give you a cow or something like that, or salt. But they also had mediums of exchange. They were not very standard, but they were recognized, cowrie shells and stuff, as I've mentioned. Now, let's move on to talk a bit about the colonial era as we move forward. As we know, from the late 19th century, European powers, they cut out Africa. You look at that map there. You can see the blue. The blue is where the French took. They grabbed all the blue there. The yellow is Congo, which was initially a farm, a private farm of King Leopold. Can you imagine having a farm that size? Eventually, because of the cruelties, the Belgians took over, but still, that is where they were. That's what the Belgians were. The maroon is where you have the British. Is it pretty much the British? Um, yes, the British. And then the green, you have the Italians. Initially, eventually, you had the Portuguese coming in. And so basically, the point here is that Africa was cut up and carved up by the colonial powers. So they introduced their currencies, and as I said, they disrupt the local systems. I've mentioned the British West African pound, the Italian East African lira, which was used in Somalia and Eritrea, the French African franc in Francophone countries, the East African rupee, which was from India, traded in India. It was replaced by the East African shilling. We still have the shilling today. The British are the ones who introduced that in their rule. And colonial currencies were often tied to the colonizers' currencies. I've made that point. The pound sterling. So Uganda was pegged to the pound, the French franc to the French currency, and so on. As I said, those were initially gold backed until World War One, and until World War One disrupted the gold standard. And the impact of this was that the colonial monetization aimed to integrate African economies into global trade, which they effectively did through cocoa, gold, palm oil. But we had no policy. As Africa, there was very limited, there was very limited, no limit, there was very limited policy agency. Any involvement that we had in policy was very limited. And in some places, there was resistance to colonial currencies. And people continued to use cowrie shells early into right into the early 20th century. Some people just resisted it. I remember a young kid, I got to know about these cowrie shells. I mean, I don't see them much these days, but my mom used to talk about them, that time. Right. So we're going to now move to a very important argument that we all need to be aware about. You may have heard of the word Bretton Woods Agreement. Okay. It was 1944. 1944, need to remember the World War ended in 1945. Okay. 1939, 1945. In 1944, there was a meeting that took place in Bretton Woods. And it established a fixed exchange rate system. Now, what they're trying to do is to bring some kind of stability, but was also had a lot of vested interest in the people involved. All major currencies were pegged to the US dollar. Remember, I told you at the beginning it was the pound. By 1920, the dollar was gaining ascendancy. And in this agreement, remember in the Second World War, the United States participated and actually was a game changer. And by that time, the Second World War made the United States. I think it really marked the end of the British Empire, and the United States began to ascend. And this meeting took place. All major currencies were now pegged to the US dollar, okay, which was in turn convertible to gold. So you had gold at $35 an ounce, and then the US dollar pegged to gold. Okay, just remember these things, very important because changes took place along the way. Gold was still there, US dollar pegged to gold, and all the other currencies pegged to the US dollar. And this exchange rate, it was a fixed exchange rate. It was formalized by the establishment of the IMF. Today we hear about the IMF, International Monetary Fund. It came out of the Bretton Woods. So you'll often hear about the Bretton Woods organizations, International Money Fund, and the World Bank. Okay? So this agreement made the US dollar the world's dominant currency and also the key reserve currency. So people would keep dollars as a reserve. And this provided money stability, global monetary stability. It provided a framework for cooperation around the world when it came to trade and finance, but it was not sustainable and it collapsed in the 1970s. What happened in the 1970s? The US unilaterally suspended the dollar's connection to gold. Again, let me just go over it again. Gold, the US dollar fixed to $35 to an ounce of gold, it was connected. They could not print more dollars than they had in gold reserves. But in the early 70s, there was the fuel crisis, the oil crisis, and all this and all this. Probably in another session, we may talk a bit about that. And the reason we are going through this is just to give us a basic understanding so that when things begin shifting around the world, you have a frame of reference to understand what's going on. So they suspended the the dollar in the early 70s. So after the Second World War, this agreement took place, and it brought a new season into the world. The US became the largest holder of gold reserves. The US had was the largest holder of gold reserves. In the recent months, you may have heard this talk in the US. Is the gold there in Fort Knox? Is Trump going to visit Fort Knox? It's talking about the reserves, It's partly due to the payments made allied. Allies, the US also had, participated in the other wars as well, in the First World War, and the Allied forces made payments, the US, World War One, World War Two, World War Two. So this made the dollar the biggest holder. The US became the biggest holder of gold reserves. It is said that by 1960, 1950, about 60% of the global reserves, 65% of global reserves were held by the US dollar. The pound had fallen to about 4.7%, though it was the leader at the beginning. Right. So, keynote here, 1945, something shifted. That was to have global impact. The dollar was the vehicle currency which facilitated world trade and grew significantly. It grew significantly up to 1973. Um, so that was what happened. How many countries were involved in this agreement? There are 44. There are 44 countries that established the IMF and the World Bank and brought the gold exchange standard um, to peg the dollar being into being. All right, I think that's enough for that time. Maybe we should just say something about what was wrong with this system. Okay, this system, as we said, collapsed. By the 1960s, it was seen that the dollar was being overvalued. France began exchanging its dollar reserves for gold. This was in the late 60s. And the effect of this, well, together the US increase in spending, led to a rise with those. You remember there was the Vietnam War, there was the Vietnam War in the 60s, which you know, caused the dollar to become overvalued because of the spending. War always increases spending, and it goes in certain quarters. War always disrupts the economy. I know we are praying for our country now. One of the things we must pray for and ask the Lord to help us with whatever changes come in the future, may we never descend to war. You just need to visit the neighboring countries to appreciate this. If you look at the East African countries, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, look at South Sudan, the countries that have struggled the most are the countries that have had civil war. Kenya has its issues, but Kenya is still the dominant economy in the region. Tanzania had slow growth, but stability does things. So whatever is happening, we should never, never allow war to come back. War just destroys everything. And the Vietnam War had its own packet effect. So the gold standard began struggle in the 60s. And in 1971, the president at that time, Nixon, announced the end of the connection of the gold standard, of gold, the US dollars with gold. It was 1971. And so this fixed exchange rates began to collapse. It actually collapsed at that time. I remember when I was really young, I remember the Uganda shilling was like 10 shillings to a pound. 10 shillings. And it was fixed. But now we entered a new season of floating exchange rates. That is what happened. And that's not too long ago. That's about 50 years ago. Um, Let me just see. I don't want to go too much. I think we need to allow time for discussion. I'll wrap up. I don't think I'm going to finish this today. We shall have another part to this. Um, and maybe at that time we shall talk about the Fed as well. So, looking at Africa, this is where we live. I know there are some guests on the call from outside Africa. You're most welcome. Uh, and I'm drawing this from Madison, the book I mentioned at the beginning. He notes the years 1950 to 1973 as a golden age of growth globally. Globally. 1950 to 1973, that's our 23 years. All over the world, it was a golden age of growth, but Africa lagged behind. While in the West, it was 4 to 6%, in Africa, it was as low as 2%. Many countries were gaining independence. Post-colonial countries now, new countries like Uganda, Kenya, all these countries, they face challenges of state building. They were relying on primary exports. Primary means you just grow and sell. That's what the president has been talking so much about. You grow coffee, you just sell it. You mine gold, you don't do anything. No value addition. Many African states retained the colonial era currencies. I think there was also a sense that if we retain that money, we're safer. But there's so much more about that money. But in some countries, there were changes. Others adapted them. Nigeria replaced the West African, with British West African pound with the Nigerian pound. And later in 1973, it became the naira, but it was initially the Nigerian pound. Uganda kept the shilling. We had an East African shilling, by the way. I wish we had kept some of those things, but Uganda, we had the Ugandan shilling, Kenyan shilling, Tanzanian shilling. It was all came from the East African shilling, which the British introduced. In 1976, the Botswana, I did mention that in my book, um, um, sorry, my mind is going blank, all these things about leadership and think tanks. I mentioned the positioning Africa of the 21st century, for the 21st century. I mentioned Botswana and its economy. They adopted the Polar in 1976. And before that, they had the South African Rand. They wanted to get their own independence. That was 1976. But the West African franc, the French franc, which is the CFA franc, it persisted in 14 countries, and they were pegged to the French franc, which later became the euro. That's relative stability because of that. But their monetary policy was tied to France. Up to now, this is still an issue. The central bank is in France. They control how much money, they control the money basically. And the goods go there. It's a whole story of its own. Some countries have begun to rebel, as you've been hearing lately in the Sahel region. But the Rwanda was also attached to that system. And then the Bretton Woods. In the Bretton Woods system, our currencies were linked indirectly to the US dollar via the colonial powers' currencies. It also stabilized trade, but it limited monetary autonomy. And the impact was for Africa. These are the image there, images. You recognize Jomo Kenyatta, Haile Selassie, Central African, Julius Nyerere, Milton Obote. You can see those faces. These are the first African leaders. A lot of promise at the time. But we are playing in a global economy where so many other things were happening. That's why it's important for us to understand what's happening. You cannot just be localized and think Uganda and Uganda shilling. What the world is so connected now that what's happening in other parts of the world affects us. So we need to make an effort to understand what's happening. And as I said before, I believe that we're entering a zone where it's clear, not I believe, I think there are clear signs that we're entering a zone where we're going to experience a shift. And we need to at least have some basic understanding of what is going on. Okay. So the impact is that while independence brought efforts to diversify economies, to make the economies have more income streams, but our reliance on commodity exports like oil in Nigeria is a very large producer of oil, copper in Zambia, all these things made us vulnerable to global price swings. And those prices are controlled from out there. Okay? So our economy grew modestly. South Africa, perhaps the biggest beneficiary because of gold, their gold production. And currency unions that were there, like the West African Currency Board, they dissolved. All these things dissolved as nations sought to get independent central banks. So political instability also affected us. Weak institutions, growth couldn't take place. Devaluations, mismanagement by leaders who did not understand economics. Inflation was fueled. And the French countries remained stable because of that pegging, but they also did not grow as much as they could have grown. I think this will be, let me just see if it's a good place to stop. I don't want to overload the system now. Uh, I think this may be a good point to stop. 1971. We're going to pick from 1971. I'll just make a note of that. When we look at the end of the gold standard, we shall pick some more from there. This is last 50 years. So we are coming closer to our time, and then we shall beyond this look at the future, what is happening and where things are going. So thank you very much for your attention. I do appreciate your attention, especially knowing most of us are not economists, but I hope I've been simple enough to give you a historical sense of what happened in the first like 70 years, 60, 70 years of the last century. And in the next part, we shall transition and then we shall bring it home to where we are. And things are moving fast around the world. So hopefully, uh, by the time things shift, we shall be understanding what is happening. Thank you very much, and God bless you.